Hi, everyone. Okay, thank you so much for joining us for this webinar titled Reclaiming the Past, Building the Future, Brownfields Basics. This webinar is being presented by the Center for Creative Land Recycling, also called CCLR, and this is part of our partnership with the Center for Community Energy and Environmental Justice, which is a long name, so we'll also call that one CJ, and they're from San Diego State University. CJ serves as one of two EPA Region 9 Environmental Justice Thriving Communities Technical Assistance Centers, which is another long name, so we're going to call them EJ Tic Tacs, and they're funded by the EPA and Department of Energy. CCLR partners with CJ to provide specialized assistance and training focused on all things land reuse. And so before we get into the content for today's webinar, I'm going to ask Jane to bring up a quick poll for everyone that's joining us. We would like to know what your level of experience in brownfields are, just before we get started, so I can kind of see who's joining us and what experience level we have here with us today. Awesome. Okay, so I'm seeing a lot of answers roll in. I'll give it just a few more seconds as people join us. Feel free to answer the poll that's up on your screen. What is your level of experience in brownfields? Okay, so it's been about a minute, so I'll ask Jane, can you end the poll and share those results? All right, so let's see. Most of you are somewhat familiar with brownfields, or it overlaps a bit with your work. The few of you have never heard of brownfields, so that's great. So this is going to be a good webinar for you to be at. You're in the right place. And some of you are pretty well informed on brownfields. And thank you so much for joining us to kind of take a refresher on this subject. Okay, so we can stop sharing that poll and get started. All right. So before, let's see. So before we get started, I want to also mention that we have a Q&A box. So you can put your questions in the Q&A box, and then any comments can go into the chat. We will have our presentation and then a Q&A section at the end. So here are the members of the CCLR team who serve as partners to CJ. So we work closely with the CJ Tic Tac to deliver technical assistance to clients working on land reuse. So from the left, we have Claire Weston, who's our Senior Program Manager at CCLR. And then myself, I'm Devin Rainwater. I'm a Senior Program Associate at CCLR. And then we also have Jane Altawara, who is going to be my partner in presenting this webinar today. So today, we will be introducing you into the world of brownfields as a potential solution to the needs in your community. And before we dive into definitions and get into the weeds with methodologies for the brownfields reuse process, I really want us to get grounded in the conversation on land reuse and take you on a little walk through town to visualize some community needs and what brownfields mean, what they can look like, and if you've ever seen them in your communities. So this is a partial map of Oakland, California. This is in the Bay Area where I live. So I thought it would be a perfect backdrop to our hypothetical stroll. And there's us. So as we walk, you can imagine yourself walking through your own neighborhood and think of what you might see in your community. So in our walk, we may see areas that are susceptible to flooding. There may be flat, paved streets with limited storm drains. As we continue, we may feel the sun beating down on us, hitting the asphalt and raising the air temperature on our streets. We may also see empty lots next to residential buildings, or we may see empty buildings next to these vacant lots. We may wish that there were more buses and access points for public transit. We may also wish for more affordable housing so that us and our neighbors can stay rooted in the area where we grew up. And we may also hope for more public healthcare infrastructure and easier access to those buildings. I'll go back. All of these needs are actually things that CCLR has heard from communities themselves. These are pressing issues of public health, climate change, and infrastructure. And due to histories of redlining, these issues are more present in lower income communities of color. These are also issues that can be addressed through land cleanup, reuse, and revitalization. So this is what we're going to be diving into today. My colleague Lou Jane and I will be introducing you to this big world of brownfields as a solution to the community needs that we just identified in the last slide. Our goal is that you walk away from this webinar with these skills and understandings. You'll be able to identify brownfields in your community or in your work. You'll be able to strategize potential end uses for those sites and to come away with a better understanding of how you can get to those reuses. You'll understand the importance of caring for the land and for the community that's there. And you'll also know how, when, and from who to ask for help. And I will say as a hint, CCLR and CJ are excellent places to start for that. So here's our plan for the next 50 minutes or so. I'm going to share a bit more about CCLR and our partners and kind of our position in this conversation. And then we'll get into the weeds a bit more on what brownfields are, how to take on land reuse. And then we'll talk through the importance of equity in the redevelopment process. And then we'll also end on a positive note on how to get started and how CCLR and CJ can be your partners in this process. Then we'll also have the Q&A session at the end of the presentation, just like I said, so please put your questions in the Q&A box. We will also be releasing a handout after this webinar with all the resources that we'll mention in the slides, plus many more resources. So you can consider this webinar as sort of a starting off point, and the upcoming resource is going to be an index for your further learning. This webinar, as a reminder, is being recorded and the slides will be available in a follow-up email. So I also want to take a moment to orient you a bit more on CCLR's position in the conversation around brownfields. So CCLR serves on CJ's partner bench to provide one-on-one assistance as well as trainings just like this one that are related to land reuse. And also to explain how we're connected within the web of many technical assistance providers, I've outlined our partners here. So for EPA, we serve as the Technical Assistance to Brownfields, or TAB provider for Regions 9 and 10, and we provide a vast array of services to communities that are taking on land reuse projects. This includes providing education on the steps of the land reuse process, how to build a team, assisting with community engagement strategies and visioning, and also with identifying and procuring funding. And these are all things that we're going to go further into later in the webinar. For DTSC, our work with the Department of Toxic Substances Control, we serve as the Brownfields Technical Assistance Provider, or BTAP, and we provide technical assistance services relating to their various land reuse grant programs, which we will also dive into later when we talk about funding opportunities. So I'm now going to pass it over to my colleague Lou Jane, who's going to take us through what a brownfield is and what they can mean in your community.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Devin. So as Devin mentioned earlier, my name is Lou Jane Altawara, and I'm a program associate at the Center for Creative Land Recycling, or CCLR. I think throughout this webinar, you'll hear a lot of abbreviations, so we'll try to spell them out, but hopefully you'll be an expert by the end of this webinar. So I'm so excited to be here with you all today. I'll get us started on what defines a brownfield, what some pollutants are, and also some examples of brownfields. And we'll also do a little activity to test your knowledge after going through these. So as indicated on the slide, a brownfield is a vacant or underutilized property with potential presence of a hazardous substance, pollutant, or contaminant, which complicates its reuse. It's important for me to emphasize that there only needs to be some perceived presence of contaminants or pollutants for something to be considered a brownfield. This point is important to keep in mind because a site does not need to have known contamination in order to access the funding available for brownfield redevelopment. And spoiler alert, we'll also be talking about how brownfields can open up a slew of funding. So, but for right now, we'll just get into the basics. It's also important to acknowledge that within brownfields, there is a disproportionate burden of brownfields in disadvantaged and low-income communities, and that's due to the fact that when industrialization first began, there were no environmental regulations against pollution. Those land use laws drove polluting industries to be located in neighborhoods with more people of color and lower incomes. These polluting industries have also caused long-lasting impacts by introducing contaminants and pollutants such as asbestos, uncontrolled water waste disposal, leaking fuel tanks, petroleum contamination, and that unfortunately leads to the creation of brownfields. So I'd also like to emphasize that brownfields do not only exist in disadvantaged and low-income communities, they really do exist. They really can and do exist everywhere. And land recycling can help mitigate those environmental injustices by centering the communities being directly affected by brownfields and ensuring they're aware of the possibilities of redevelopment. Devin will also dive deeper into equitable redevelopment in just a bit. So some examples of brownfields are important for me to go over because it'll be helpful for our activity. So brownfields include, but are definitely not limited to shuttered gas stations, abandoned factories, oil drilling sites, vacant parking lots, and even closed dry cleaners. In my opinion, the definition of brownfields is quite broad, which can seem pretty overwhelming. But fortunately, there's also an abundance of available federal, state, and local grants, resources, and partnerships you can utilize to get you started and learn what a brownfield is, like this one, and just learn more about the world of brownfields. So next slide, please. So now we'll go into our brownfield identification activity. I've listed a couple of examples of brownfields, what can cause brownfields, what are some contaminants in brownfields, and I just want to provide everyone a chance to kind of test that knowledge. I know it's pretty early in the webinar, but I think it will be really helpful, and I hope you find it helpful as well. So next slide, please. So for this brownfield identification activity, I'll show a photo of a site, and I want everyone in the chat to say true if you think it is a brownfield or false if you think it's not a brownfield. So to start off, is this abandoned gas station in Middlefield, USA true, a brownfield, true or false? Okay, I see all the answers coming in. Lots of trues. Okay, I'll give it a couple more seconds. Devin, could you reveal the answer, please? True. Okay, great job to everyone who answered true. So this site is a brownfield, and it started off pretty easy, right? I mentioned that abandoned gas stations or closed gas stations are a very prime example of brownfields. So thank you all for paying attention. This gas station is abandoned and no longer in use, and there's very likely contamination from the petroleum given that it is a gas station. Okay, so if you didn't get this slide correct, which it doesn't seem like that was the case, there will be more opportunities because this activity isn't over yet. Next slide, please. Okay, so this old horse nail factory in Hartford, Connecticut, is this a brownfield? True or false? True. Okay, lots of answers coming in. Perfect. So let's reveal the answer, please. Okay, awesome. Yes, it is a brownfield. You guys are really killing it. Not only is it no longer in use, it's a manufacturing site that probably has pollutants such as asbestos, and these kinds of factories can be major contributors to air pollution, hence making it a brownfield. Okay, next slide, please. So this abandoned orchard in East Wenatchee, Washington, is it a brownfield? True or false? It may be a hard one, but do your best. Okay, I'm seeing some mixed answers. I'll give it a couple more seconds for everyone to get their answers in. Okay, I feel like it's kind of split down the middle. So can we reveal the answer? It is a brownfield. Okay, good job, Ursula. So this site is also a brownfield, and it was kind of a tricky question because there's definitely a common misconception about how brownfields are supposed to look. Oftentimes people assume that brownfields can only look like the 2 previous slides we just went over, but that's not necessarily always the case. It's important to remember that orchards can also be considered brownfields due to the fact that they can fall under the category of agricultural sites that may have used pesticides or herbicides. Like I mentioned earlier, brownfields have such a broad definition, so even a potential presence of contamination can classify this site as a brownfield. Okay, next slide, please. This is the last one for the activity. Is this elementary school a brownfield? True or false? Okay, I'm seeing lots of trues. I did see a couple of false. Okay, a couple more seconds. Let's reveal the answer. So yes, it is a brownfield. It's vacant and it probably has a potential presence of contamination since it was once used by humans. Also, if we don't know the past history of a site, for example, like this elementary school, it can also be considered a brownfield, and there are steps in place to determine what the use history is of this elementary school and how to remediate that. Whether it's actually contaminated or not, we're not sure, but because of that, it can fall under that classification, and there are steps to take to remediate this. Okay, so thank you all for participating in this little activity, just something to engage you all. So great job to everyone. We hope that it was helpful and it gave you a better sense of what a brownfield could be and how, even though the classification is so broad, the opportunities for reuse are as well. So next slide, please. In this slide, I'll talk a little bit about what issues arise with having brownfields in your community, and for those reasons, why it's important to identify, prioritize, clean up, and reuse brownfield sites in order to help mitigate those issues. So some examples of brownfields, of issues that arise with brownfields are reduction in employment opportunities, diminishing the quality of life for neighbors, increasing illegal activity, and really importantly, creating public health issues due to potential pollution. So like I mentioned earlier, how that old factory can contribute to air pollution within the neighborhood, that's a big issue. And we want to ensure that the individuals living within that community have access to clean air. That's just a human right, and that should be accessible to anyone and everyone. So we've talked a lot about contamination pollutants already, but like I mentioned earlier, the public health issues are important to acknowledge, especially since brownfields can be located near residential buildings, and as mentioned earlier, in lower income or Black, Indigenous, people of color communities that may already be experiencing health disparities due to the inequities present in healthcare. Unfortunately, brownfields are very interconnected with a variety of injustice issues in general and can even exacerbate them. But at the same time, redeveloping these kinds of sites helps mitigate those environmental injustice issues. So now Devin will go through all the benefits that come with brownfield redevelopment, or like what we like to call it as well, land recycling, and more importantly, how that process needs to be done equitably. Devin, take it away.
Thank you so much, Lou Jane, for doing an excellent job covering the issues that brownfields can really contribute to. So once you identify, the issues that your community is facing, and you notice any sites of interest that it can be causing these issues, you can utilize the resources that are available for brownfields redevelopment to turn a vacant property into a community benefit. So by revitalizing a brownfield site, we can do wonderful things such as mitigate the effects of climate change by reducing sprawl, conserving open space, and increasing climate resilient infrastructure such as rain gardens or living roofs. We can provide affordable housing, increase public parks, reduce contamination in the area, which improves public health conditions, and we can create jobs by increasing retail or commercial space, for example. So these items in this list are all achieved through the success of the reuse. And we also want to talk about the process of getting there and getting to that reuse. So first and foremost, as we talk about the brownfields redevelopment process, we need to talk about incorporating equity into that process. So equitable redevelopment practices really promote fairness and justice, improve conditions for future generations, and can heal or begin to heal relationships between people and the land. that's there. Brownfield reuse really presents the opportunity to advance equity by addressing environmental injustices and meeting community needs at the same time. It's a conscious, deliberate practice of prioritizing the most neglected, highest need areas, especially when brownfields are present there. So, to ground this in the conversation of what's happening now, current federal programs, local initiatives, and general changes surrounding land reuse and how we talk about land reuse are increasing attention on the need to incorporate these equitable development principles into the work that we're doing and to address the gaps that are present within the brownfield reuse process. So these 5 principles came out of CCLR's close work with Groundwork USA, which is an organization dedicated to equity and land reuse. It's really important to be aware of these principles as you begin your revitalization projects and that you incorporate them at each step of the way. So this is, again, an overview and an introduction to these concepts, which are big concepts. So we will be sharing resources from Groundwork USA after the webinar so that you can further explore these principles and the actions that support them. But for now, it's really good to get familiar with these principles. So you want to be able to share leadership and decision-making power with the community that you're working in. You need to learn and acknowledge the history of racial and social injustices that exist in that community. Recognize and value the local knowledge of the community members that are there. And this includes conducting research and understanding the demographics of people that live there and the issues that are most important to them. You also want to meet people where they're at, and this includes all stakeholders that are in the project. You want to make each step of the Brownfields process an accessible thing that people can access. You also want to build intentional partnerships with the community that exists in the place that you are conducting your Brownfields reuse work. So with that said, let's also get into the tangible steps of Brownfields reuse. So I will say that even though this slide reads from left to right, this process does not always happen in this order, and the steps are not always so defined. So they may overlap or may happen at different times or happen all throughout the project. Each Brownfields project can be very different and no two look the same. These are just the 5 major components of any Brownfields project that you really want to have included. So to start, you want to establish your team. You want to pull together your stakeholders, identify the community groups that are in the area that you're going to be working with, and you want to establish a relationship with a community liaison or a project champion. And really, like I said, understand the demographics and the needs of the community that you're working in. This will then lead you to the next step, which involves developing an inventory and selecting sites for your reuse. So because you've done the work of making connections with the community, ideally you are aware of the needs of the community and then can use mapping tools, surveys, and conduct further research to identify the properties that will best meet those existing needs for redevelopment. At this point, you'll want to really have a good idea of what your reuse will be, because this is really important for determining where your site or where is best location for this reuse, what stakeholders are going to need to be involved, and what funding sources you're going to be most eligible for. You'll also need to have as much information about the property as you can get. So you'll want to know who owns the site and if you have access to it and more. Then you'll want to go into the next step, which is assessment. So you'll need to evaluate the features of the property, including the buildings and any potential contamination that is present. I want to say again that at this point, that a brownfield site does not need to have confirmed contamination for it to be eligible for brownfields funding and processes. You can access free EPA resources to conduct an initial site assessment using the Targeted Brownfield Assessment or TBA program, for example. We'll talk through this more later when we talk about funding sources and resources. So once you have your site assessment and you can see if there is contamination present there, you'll need to complete your plan for reuse and conduct site visioning. So here again, you'll engage with the community. Potentially you'll host visioning sessions and you'll develop your plan for cleanup and reuse. It's very important to involve the community at this point and to incorporate barriers against displacement. This reuse is intended for the current community's benefit, and it's very important to have anti-displacement measures in place so that the reuse can benefit the existing community. So then when you have your plan and you're ready to go, we move into project implementation. So during this step, the site is cleaned up, development begins, and those funding resources are accessed. So I'm very happy to follow up that big download of information with this picture of some of the smiling faces of the CCLR and EPA team members. So this is a big reminder that CCLR is your partner in this land reuse process. You do not need to go at each of these steps alone. And in fact, the secret is the path to success really involves engaging partners all along the way. As it says here, our mission is to promote the sustainable, equitable, and responsible reuse of underutilized and environmentally impacted properties. And this means that we will support you at each step of the way. So at the end of the webinar, you'll see our contact information and learn about a few ways to get involved and in touch with us. But right now, I'm going to pass it over again to my colleague Lou Jane to go through some project funding sources and also to provide some more insight into CCLR's services.
Thank you, Devin. So next slide, please. So we just wanted to talk a little bit about the funding available for Brownfield redevelopment, because we don't want people to feel discouraged by maybe after this webinar, they realize like, wow, there's a lot of brownfields in my community. What can I do? So we just want to emphasize that there's so much funding available for brownfield redevelopment. And like Devin has been emphasizing, CCLR and CJ are really there to help you get started and figure out what your next steps are, where to go from here, and what that can look like. So I wanted to go over first funding sources that are specific for brownfield remediation and redevelopment. One of the biggest unknowns that honestly may prevent a community from pursuing redevelopment is answering the question, where will the money come from? I also want to say that redevelopment financing is quite difficult and can be overwhelming. However, no one is expecting you to take this on by yourself. The beauty of Brownfields is that it really does take a village, and there are so many people that you can ask for help, whether that's within your own community or within federal, state, or local partnerships. So the grants listed on the screen, like I mentioned earlier, are specific for brownfield redevelopment and remediation. And I'll cover a bit about what each funding source can cover. And yes, for clarification, there will be overlap between some of these funding sources. So the Targeted Brownfield Assessment is a program that provides cost-free technical assistance through EPA contractors to conduct brownfield assessment activities, such as an environmental site assessment, to determine what the cleanup process could look like for a site. So sometimes these assessments, they could find contamination, and that there needs to be the second step of cleaning up and remediating that site, or in doing that assessment, they may not find contamination at all. And a really great thing about this TBA program is that it's available locally on a rolling basis, and unlike a grant, it doesn't require a lengthy application process at all. It's very much like filling out a few boxes, and I think it's about 1 or 2 pages. And CCLR is here to help you determine whether you're eligible to apply for a TBA or not. So the next grant we have listed is the Equitable Community Revitalization Grant, and that also comes from one of our partners, DTSC. So ECRG provides the opportunity to apply to 3 different grants that include community-wide assessments, site-specific investigations, or site-specific cleanup. And similarly, the Multi-Purpose Assessment Revolving Loan Fund Cleanup Grant, or MARC, which is, thank God for these abbreviations, allows communities to apply for grants based on their specific needs, including, like we mentioned before, environmental assessments, site cleanups, or funding to conduct a range of eligible activities, for example, the multi-purpose part of MARC, at 1 or more brownfield sites in a target area. And finally, the technical assistance grant, which was just launched late in December of 2023, provides funds that range from $40,000 to $150,000 to eligible communities to hire independent technical advisors with the goal to effectively communicate technical information to communities so they can become more involved and informed about cleanup sites. The purpose of the TAG grant is really to kind of bridge that communication gap between communities and the technical side of brownfields, help them understand what is happening within their community and on these sites so that they can be much more involved in the process and ensure that their voices are heard throughout this entire redevelopment. Next slide, please. So the funding sources on this slide can support land reuse, but are not necessarily specific to brownfields. So they can fund aspects of brownfield redevelopment, but again, may just focus on a larger scope. For example, some of these funding sources may be more general and support projects that reduce pollution, increase community climate resilience, and just build community capacity in general to address environmental and climate justice challenges. However, you can still use these funding sources and apply for them for aspects of brownfield redevelopment because that kind of redevelopment helps aid the reduction of pollution and increase of climate resilience. Another disclaimer I'd like to add, which is a good disclaimer actually, is that these are only very few examples of funding sources that can support land reuse. There are so many more funding opportunities available at the local, state, and federal level. And one of CCLR's main roles is to help you identify and secure that funding and figure out which ones you are eligible for and which would work best for your community. Next slide, please. So now that we've talked a bit about brownfield redevelopment, kind of set that foundation, and I just want to go a little bit into what CCLR does and what our services consist of. And I also want to give you all the opportunity to connect with us after this webinar. So I'm just going to launch this poll that is completely optional to fill out. If you have more questions or you would like to have a longer conversation about this entire process, feel free to fill this poll question out and I'll go through CCLR services. So on the topic of CCLR's roles, I just like to share some services that are completely free that CCLR offers. Because we are a technical assistance provider, we're able to help you with this redevelopment process literally every step of the way. So Devin has talked about that a little bit earlier, but CCLR can work with you on training and support for getting started. Like we've been mentioning, this webinar was created for community members, public entities, tribes, municipalities to just learn more about brownfields and figure out how to revitalize their communities and understand where this funding can come from. We can also help you identify project funding. Like I mentioned earlier, we are so tapped in to the amount of funding that's available federally at the state level and the local level that we want to ensure that communities are so aware of these types of resources. We can also help you craft a strong grant application. This does not mean that CCLR can write the application for you. We are not grant writers. We can review your application and help ensure that you are completing all the requirements of a grant application and review it and ensure that it is strong. But again, we do not write grants, but we can help you identify that funding, ensure that you are eligible, and just help you understand the solicitation process. CCLR services also includes conducting reuse visioning with the community. So we really like to emphasize the community engagement aspect of brownfield redevelopment. And again, ensuring that communities are the ones centered within these conversations. This site lives in your neighborhood. You are the ones who have the agency to decide what happens with that site and what it can turn into. And that's something that we like to stress a lot. We can help plan these types of community engagement meetings, facilitate them, and really help the community understand how this is a benefit. We also provide services on implementing project strategy for cleanup and reuse. So like I mentioned earlier, taking you through every step of the brownfield redevelopment process and understanding what that end use will be and what your end goal will be. Okay, so thank you all for those who answered the poll and wanting to get in touch with us after this webinar. And I'll go over into the next slide and other ways that you can get involved with us as well. So we'd really love for all of you to engage with CCLR and CJ. We don't want you to leave this webinar feeling like you're not sure what to do next. We want to ensure that your next step can be reaching out to us and understanding, okay, I have a good idea of brownfields. I can figure out how to look for them within my neighborhood, but what else can I do? So with that said, you can schedule a free technical assistance meeting with CJ or CCLR. You can join our upcoming webinars and learn some more about really the process of brownfields, get into the nitty-gritty of them. You can find us at conferences and workshops. Because CCLR is so spread out within our team member base, we try to attend a variety of conferences and workshops to allow community members so that we can meet with community members in person and really understand the different issues that communities face. So find us at any conference and workshop, and we always promote whether or not we'll be at one. And you can also sign up for our newsletters. So we have the CCLR newsletter and then the CJ newsletter linked. Both newsletters provide such great resources for this type of land recycling, for environmental justice issues, resources that are very helpful for your communities. And yeah, so we really encourage that you sign up for our newsletter, because that encapsulates a lot of the information that we provide at this webinar here today, as well as future opportunities to work with us or to schedule calls with us and just to keep in touch. Next slide, please. And then we'd also like to just do a little plug of our upcoming events where you can learn more about brownfields and also just become more involved within this field. So at the end of February, we have the Land Reuse and Community Development Funding Fair happening in person at San Diego State University. Like I mentioned earlier, the redevelopment financing aspect of brownfield can be so difficult. And that's why we want to ensure that you feel like you have the support you need to tackle these types of issues. At the funding fair, you'll have the opportunity to talk to so many different funding entities that are literally the creators of these funding sources, and understand the solicitation process, the application process. And of course, CCLR and our partners will be there to help you and provide technical assistance throughout the grant application and see if you're even eligible to apply for these opportunities. We also have upcoming webinars that will be happening in February and March. So as you see on the screen, we have quite a couple coming up. And if you subscribe to our newsletter, that's where you'll receive the registration link as we update them. So in February, we'll have a webinar focused on the targeted brownfield assessment program that I briefly mentioned earlier. So that's titled TBH, you need a TBA, just a little fun play on words. February 29th, we'll have Unveiling Energy Justice, Exploring the Basics. So like I mentioned earlier, brownfields are so interconnected with so many different disciplines, and it'd be really great for people to attend that webinar and understand how those two can be connected. And also, I know that the funding fair and that webinar is on the same day, but the funding fair ends at 2 p.m., which means you can join the webinar at 3 p.m. And March 7th, we'll also be diving even deeper into the available environmental justice funding opportunities and understanding how you can use that within your brownfield redevelopment process. March 19th is an Introduction to Healthy Places Index. So that'll go into just an index of healthy places, and you'll have more information in the newsletter as well. So that's happening March 19th. Just a reminder that you'll also be receiving these slides, so you can bookmark all of these dates on your calendar. Next slide, please. Perfect. And I'll pass it off to Devin to close off the webinar. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lujane, for that excellent download of information on funding sources and how to get engaged with CCLR. So I would like to wrap up our presentation with a big summary and a hopeful note. So I want to say that land reuse and brownfields redevelopment are steps towards an environmentally just future. Revitalizing previously used land not only reduces pollution and health risks, it improves quality of life, it keeps people where they are, and it creates opportunities for connection, art, culture, joy, access to food, and all the wonderful things that we want to see in all of our communities. And I also want to thank all of you for being here today and being a part of this work. This is the work that's going to get us to an environmentally just future, and I am very thankful for all of you for starting your journey into brownfields today, or taking this as a refresher course on what's available in brownfields. So we will now move into a Q&A section. So you can put your questions into the Q&A box. That's a part of the webinar like toolbox on the bottom there. And we'll get to all of your questions. And if we don't get to all of the questions today, we will send out a written response with all the questions. And as we go through questions, here's our contact information for you to take note of. You have the CCLR contact info and CJ there to get you started and to contact us. So it looks like we've got a few questions in the Q&A box. And so I see from Shelley Gordon, you're asking, what are examples of brownfield conversions? You're familiar with brownfields being used for solar and wind projects. What are other examples? So that's a great question. So we mentioned that brownfields, can be used to meet the existing needs of communities. So some examples of brownfields reuses, there are so many things that you could do with a brownfield site. It really depends on what your community needs. So perhaps there is a lack of grocery stores in your community, and you can use a brownfield site to build a grocery store, depending on the contamination that is present. Brownfield sites can be used for affordable housing. They can be used for community health centers. A reuse that I particularly love to hear about are community hubs. So those are just community centers that can be used for a variety of things, including emergency response or disaster training, or can be used as centers where people can get together. So there's many opportunities for reuse, and it really depends on what your community is looking for.
Great answer, Devin. I also know that there was a much earlier question during the brownfield identification activity asking if an abandoned organic orchard can be considered brownfield. And yes, it actually can be, because since even if the orchard was originally organic, we don't know what has happened since it has been an active site to since it has been abandoned, essentially. So that kind of time frame makes us unaware of its history of use, even if part of it was organically used and there were no herbicides and pesticides used. So great question, Cecilia.
Great, and I can also see that Shelley put another comment. So perhaps people in this webinar can name brownfields projects that they have worked on. So that would be an interesting thing if you have worked with CCLR or have brownfields projects that you would like to share. You can absolutely put that in the chat for the benefit of other folks in this webinar. And we would totally love to hear from you what projects you've worked on. Someone else has the question, do brownfields have regions like CCLR? So I believe, I want to make sure I'm understanding this question correctly. If you're asking if there is a regional restriction to brownfields work, there is not. So in the United States, the states are separated into EPA regions. CCLR works primarily with EPA regions 9 and 10, and CJ is the Technical Assistance Center for Region 9. And you can access, I'd love to put this resource in the chat. You can access all the different TA providers for each of the different regions, and through a website that we can put in the chat. I have my big screen open right now, so I can't access that yet, but there are other technical assistance providers for the other regions. Okay, see another question. Can residential homes be brownfields, or are they eligible for brownfields funding? So brownfields are sites that are vacant. So I believe, I want to interpret this question as homes that are vacant can be brownfield sites. So if there is a building on a vacant site that has potential contamination, yes, that is a brownfield, even if there are buildings present on the site.
I also see another question asking, can past oil drilling sites be used for housing? So that's a really interesting question. And again, it's kind of a case-by-case basis where, yes, past oil drilling sites are considered brownfields, but in order to use them for housing, essentially at the residential level, a certain amount of cleanup needs to be conducted. So it's a case-by-case basis. And if you want to talk more about that site specifically, you can feel free to reach out to us and we can let you know what that process would look like.
And there's another question. Can you use brownfield funding for an abandoned contaminated property that is reused for a non-community reason, like a private developer putting in apartments in a non-low income environment? So since brownfield funding is directed at low income communities that are facing environmental justice issues, it is very unlikely that a project by a private developer, let's say putting in luxury apartments, is not going to be eligible for funding by Brownfields programs, or will not have a strong chance of winning, let's say, an EPA MARC grant. Brownfields funding is primarily used for community needs and community related reuses.
Great answer. Also, I think Imogen Nelson put in the Q&A, we are working on our first Brownfield grant and CCLR has been instrumental in helping us move through the process. Thank you. We love to hear that. So we're glad we've been helpful. Anne Maria also asked, can multiple addresses, but all in the same intersection, be considered one project? So all of the addresses are owned by one entity. I think that's a really interesting question. I think the first thing that comes to mind is a brownfield inventory and determining whether those addresses have different priorities, whether one is higher on the priorities, if one is a higher priority than the other based on what it needs to be developed. What needs to be redeveloped there. Devin, do you want to expand on that?
Can multiple addresses on the same intersection be considered one project? So it really depends on how the site is parceled and who owns the site. I think we don't have enough information just based on this question to provide an answer. This would be a further discussion. We would have to see the geography of the area, as well as who has site access and who owns those sites that are at the multiple addresses. Sometimes things can get complicated like that when you have zoning issues or multiple owners of one site or different sites that are right next to each other. And these are kind of the case-by-case projects that CCLR can really help you piece apart and work through. So I totally recommend you reach out to us. That would be excellent. Okay, so let's see. Are there any more questions that are?
Yeah, so oh, sorry. Janae asked, you can go ahead and answer this question, but Janae asked, what is possible for closed landfills?
Oh, I see. And what are things to consider for reusing closed landfills? I would say that this is another thing that I would love to set up a meeting with you to discuss this project. It really depends on, we would like to have more information about the site and about the landfill, where it is, who the owner is, what the access is for this site. So I think setting up a conversation with CCLR would be a great next step.
Yeah. And I know that Janae also asked earlier if we have a physical office to walk into to meet. We actually don't. All of our team members work remotely because we're also spread out across the nation. But oftentimes we can do site visits and meet communities where they are physically. So depending on that, that can be a further conversation that we can have as well. I know that Shelley Gordon also mentioned that in the Phoenix metro area, we need more cooling stations during our 5 summer months of 110 plus daily temperatures, especially for people who are unhoused. I think the really cool thing about brownfields is that if that's the case, one of the first things you can do is conduct a brownfield inventory, which means determining sites in those areas that can be considered brownfields and how those can be turned into cooling stations for individuals who are unhoused and how it can be a benefit for the community. If that's a further conversation you'd like to have, Shelley, again, feel free to reach out to us. And
I
then
also saw that I answered this question over already just over text. Someone asked, wildfire can cause soil contamination. Are sites in burn scars eligible? So this is an excellent question that goes into brownfields that can be created through natural disasters, including wildfires, flooding, and that these sites are eligible for brownfields funding. Again, we would want to talk through the specifics of the site to find the most relevant funding for that project, but these absolutely can be considered brownfields. So I wanted to bring that up again for the whole group.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's so relevant, especially here in California.
Mm-hmm.
Brenda asked, how does site ownership affect site eligibility for brownfield funding for reuse? That's a very important question. Devin, would you like to expand on that?
Yeah, so site ownership affects site eligibility for brownfield funding for reuse. So this is important when we're talking about if you have access to the site. It also depends on who's the owner of the site and who is the responsible, if there is contamination, who's the responsible party for the contamination. And this can create, there's a variety of eligibilities for different grant programs. So this would be another thing that we would want to discuss when talking about which funding source is most relevant for this project. We would want to talk about who owns the site, who has access, if there's contamination, who's the responsible party, and that will help us determine what funding source is going to be best suited for that project. I also see someone asked, what types of organizations and agencies are eligible to apply for brownfield funding? Can it be any group that manages to identify a brownfield site, or does it have to be a specific development organization? This is a really good question. Again, with various funding sources, there's going to be a variety of eligibility requirements. For example, with the TAG program from DTSC, the eligibility is if you are a community group, you can be eligible for that grant. If you are applying for the community change grants, which is a new EJ funding source from EPA, you can be a nonprofit that has to also have a partner, and 2 entities need to apply. So there are different eligibility requirements for different funding sources. And typically, if you're a community group or a grassroots group, you're going to need to have a partner. The best thing is going to be to partner with a nonprofit in your community that's doing relevant work, or to partner with the city or the county and establish collaboration there. But again, it's going to take some looking into specific eligibilities for grant programs.
Yeah, great answer, Devin. And again, like we mentioned earlier, we can really help determine and help you figure out if you are eligible for certain funding opportunities. And then Josh brought up a great comment that in Alaska, oftentimes you are not eligible for most funding available, especially from EPA. Alaska is a special case, and because CCLR is not only a technical assistance provider for Region 9, we also cover Region 10, which includes Alaska. And we have some great consultants on our team that can really delve specifically into funding available for community groups, nonprofits, municipalities in Alaska, and what funding opportunities are available there. Josh, if you'd like to continue this conversation further, please reach out to us, and we'd love to help you out with that.
Absolutely. And also, as we kind of have our Q&A box is empty at this point. I'm looking through the webinar chat, and I would recommend that everyone in the webinar can download the chat because some folks are putting in their contact information. Folks are dropping in excellent resources related to land reuse work. So I'm excited to look through the chat and to see the conversations that folks have been having. And so we'll be sure to get that downloaded. And also, if you've left your contact information in the chat for us to reach out to you, we will get back to you after the webinar. So we'll also, as we're wrapping up and closing up our Q&A, I want to remind everyone that this webinar was recorded, and we will send out the recording and the slides in a follow-up email later this week, along with a detailed handout that goes through the concepts discussed in this webinar, along with all of the relevant resources. That's going to be coming to you in your inboxes later this week.
Thank you all so much for taking the time to join us. We really appreciate you being here.
Yeah, and I see there's no questions left. So we really encourage you to get into contact with us if any questions come up, or if you would like to have a one-on-one technical assistance call, that would be excellent. So thank you so much to all of you for joining this webinar. I look forward to hearing from you, and take care. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.